Hello and welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Andrew O'Hare, executive editor of Salon, and joining me today, it's an entirely in-house program, which should be exciting. Joining me today is Salon's West Coast editor, but he's live on a pretty cold day in New York, which is quite different from a day you would encounter on the West Coast. From our San Francisco office here in New York, Keith Spencer of Salon. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you.
And Keith is the author of a new book, which I think is really fascinating and worth your time, and not just because he works at Salon. I read it with great interest. The book is called A People's History of Silicon Valley. And Keith, is this book out now, available for purchase?
It is out now. You can...
From all major retailers, online and otherwise?
Yeah, you could call your local indie bookstore. You can get it on the big sites, or you can order it directly from the publisher, which is Eyewear Publishing.
But, for example, the one that is sort of the A****ZON, can you buy it there?
You can
Okay,
buy it.
cool.
You can buy it on the site owned by Bezos. Yeah.
Now, let's talk first of all about the title and then about how you sort of set out to write this book. A People's History of Silicon Valley. There are a lot of books at this point that are a people's history of XYZ, but you specifically make clear that you are referring to, the late great Howard Zinn, the historian,
Correct.
who may not have invented that term, but certainly, made it go big. And so talk about your relationship to that tradition in history.
Yeah, so there is this kind of like tradition of the People's History title book, like the People's History of the United States, the one that started it, and there's People's History of the World, of ancient Greece, of London, and I read a lot of them when I was like,
French Revolution, published not long ago, yeah.
Yeah, it's the reason this book was sort of like, I wanted to write a book that was in the sort of tradition of that, of like telling the story of a place like Silicon Valley, but from the perspective of like, the workers that made it and the people who are involved in, creating products but aren't as seen because of the way the industry sort of glorifies the people at the top, and also of like the people who are displaced in the process of Silicon Valley being created, which includes a lot of my own family. But what was made it, I think, the challenge was that Silicon Valley isn't just a place, the way that ancient Greece or the French Revolution happened in a place, or London is. It's also just kind of like an idea, the idea of the tech industry at large. So like the challenge of the book was that I had to write this kind of dual history where I was like, in the beginning it's more geographic. It's like this is what was happening in Northern California at this time. But then later, especially as like the internet developed and the tech industry became, its tendrils sort of wrapped the whole planet. A lot of the book is sort of like about how the gadgets and the things that the tech industry does affect like the world at large and people on far-flung corners of the planet, and can spontaneously change, make or destroy their lives.
I thought that was really interesting, the way that you talk about some things that we've heard a fair amount about, like Foxconn and its factories in China with the intense working conditions, very hostile working conditions at times. But you also talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, where the metals are made from which semiconductors and other microchip technologies are actually built, the physical stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
I loved that, and I do appreciate the way that this is for any of you who have a connection to Northern California, the Bay Area. I was born there and have lived in New York for 20 years. Keith was born somewhere else, but now lives in the Bay Area, and you have family connections. We'll talk about that. Anybody who has that history is going to find this really interesting, because it both is and is not a history of this place, and the way that this place has been changed and has changed the world.
Right.
Talk a little bit about how you came to that part of it.
Right. Well, I mean, you can sort of track like different phases of how Silicon Valley grew over the years. Like in the beginning, it was like the Santa Clara Valley, as it was called then, was like a place where there was a lot of semiconductor production, and the defense industry was really interested in integrated circuits, so they could put them on ICBMs to nuke the Soviet Union, and so it had all these sort of defense connections in the beginning, and then like later it went through sort of like the pre-web phase, when we think of like Microsoft and IBM and Apple and stuff like that. But there's kind of like this interesting undercurrent that goes through all of it, where like it's always been, Silicon Valley has always been a place that sells itself as like creating the future.
Absolutely.
The thing about Western civilization is that we think of technology and progress as synonymous. And so because of the name of the tech industry, what it's called, it sort of like has really benefited from this idea of itself as being synonymous with progress, even when maybe the things that the corporations within Silicon Valley are doing are very not progressive at all, or maybe even regressive in terms of how they're, chipping away at democracy or democratic institutions, or pushing this kind of like, subtle rhetoric, subtle kind of like elitist rhetoric or something like that. I really wanted to get at the root of that and like write about expose the rhetorical ways that Silicon Valley sells itself as visionary, and then by when I say Silicon Valley, I mean like mainly these huge tech companies,
right?
And the people who work for them. But it's sort of an illusion. Like there's not really anything different. I mean, the car industry or the snack foods industry are not really fundamentally different than the tech industry in what they want to do.
Right.
Their goal is to make money, and
right.
They'll do whatever they can in the
right.
process.
This is partly a book about an area of capitalist development, and also about the myth that particular industry was able to create around itself. That it was not. It was essentially, in some ways, not a part of regular capitalist development.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's something. So this is actually, to go back in history, like it's interesting because one of the side effects of like McCarthyism during the Cold War was that a lot of people came to believe, especially after the Cold War ended, that there was like no alternative to the kind of like liberal capitalist democracies that we have. That this was the best we could do. That there was no other way that we could organize society. And the side effect of that like propaganda was that a lot of young people nowadays and in the last 20 years, they look at the world and they're like, well, this is the best we can do. How am I going to change the world? And they see Silicon Valley and they're like, oh, technology is going to change the world. Like this is a great utopian place. This is how, because we have no political hope besides the current situation, like they find hope in the business speak and the techno speak of Silicon Valley. And it's interesting, like if any of like our people watching right now have ever hung out around like Stanford particularly, it's sort of a fount of this rhetoric. Like it's fascinating. Like I've met a lot of people when I was doing research for this book, and people I knew previously who like will be like, yeah, I studied business or I studied tech because I want to change the world.
Yes.
Which is so interesting because it's like I would study politics if I want to, like, or like art if I want to change the world, but.
And nobody perhaps epitomized this better or capitalized it more effectively than the late Steve Jobs, right? Who was, I'm happy to give him credit and say in many ways he was a brilliant person, but perhaps most brilliant as a marketer, right?
Yeah, he was a brilliant marketer, and it was like the image of himself was just, I mean, I don't know how well he understood these things. It's always hard to tell in retrospect, but like he created an image of himself as a brand, like his sort of the turtlenecks and the way that he moved on stage, the way that his sort of strange manner of speaking and stuff, like created this idea of him being a visionary. But like if you go back and you look at like what his life was like, he really just like ran over so many people to get. He was probably a sociopath to some degree.
Very difficult person, as anybody who did business with him knows. Keith, tell us a little bit about what drove you personally, because I think that's actually an interesting part of the story. Your family history and personal history that brought you to this book.
Right. Yeah. So I grew up in like a really sciencey family. I had a lot of scientists in my family, and a lot of Bay Area history. A lot of my family. I wasn't born there, but my dad and everyone on my dad's side was, going back 6 generations or so.
Which is, you said that they were actually among the white people who came by covered wagon to California, right?
Yeah. My great grandmother Maggie May came by covered wagon from Iowa to Oregon, and then from Oregon she took a wagon down here that would have been 1870s or something like that. It was a long time ago. And they had a lot of orchards and such, and like a lot of my family's history there was agricultural. They were like, apricot and plum and walnut orchards.
At one time, a huge part of that, like the Santa Clara Valley, as it was called then.
Right. Well, yeah, and it was also, before it was called Silicon Valley, it was called the Valley of Heart's Delight because of all the flowers that you would see when you're driving down El Camino Real from all the orchards. But I really watched like I don't have many family that lives there anymore because everybody's been gentrified out or evicted over the years. And actually, my grandfather was born in like Mountain View and like lived in the Bay Area for his whole life, with the exception of when he was off fighting World War II. And then he got evicted at age 90 from his place in Menlo Park.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, and so after he got evicted, you know, he and his partner thought like they would try to move to Chico, California, because it was affordable.
Central Valley.
Valley, yeah. And basically what happened was like the short story is that he moved there, and the stress of living in a place where he'd never really been and didn't know anything, he like lost his memory, and his sort of, you know, dementia got worse and his quality of life got really bad. So gentrification really kind of like affected or impacted his life. So I'd always had that perspective, you know, a sort of innately critical perspective on Silicon Valley, because I was like, you know, this is such, if people use the phrase like tech community a lot, like the Silicon Valley community, but like there was no one there for him. There was no one like advocating for him to like stay in his house and like he, you know, I would argue he probably had more of a right to stay in the only place he knew than, you know, whatever like venture capitalist moved into his house after he got evicted or whatever. But then the other thing is that I mentioned my scientist family before. So I have a background. I studied physics as an undergrad, and I was like a science and math teacher in San Francisco and Menlo Park for a while. And
what age kids did you teach? Just
high school.
High school kids. Okay.
High school kids.
Yeah.
And I think being around a lot of like, you know, STEM people gave me perspective on what is sometimes called STEM supremacy, like the idea that the forms of knowledge that are trafficked in that STEM forms of knowledge, science, technology, engineering, math, that those forms of knowledge are kind of like innately superior.
Because inherently quantifiable? Is that part of the reason?
Yeah, they're quantifiable. I mean, we could have a philosophy discussion.
Seemingly more objective. Okay.
There was you know, this book by the French philosopher Lyotard that came out in the 80s, The Postmodern Condition, I believe it was called.
Sure.
And he sort of articulates that, like, you know, basically in a postmodern world where religion is no longer like a universal reference point, the only universal reference point that a lot of people have philosophically is like science and math. And so like
boy, we could go to a whole tangent right now, couldn't we? Wow, about the sort of doubt that has emerged around that recently. But let's not get distracted into Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, I guess the point is, like, you know, there is this. A lot of us have probably felt that, like, and it is often paired with like sort of chauvinism. Like people who are in tech or have sort of the tech or science knowledge think that their way of thinking, or that they have that knowledge, makes them sort of like superior to other people, or or know more about things, you know, like just can comment on anything because they understand science and math and physics. I got a big dose of this when I was a physics major in college, where it was like all the physics students thought that since they understood physics, they understood the whole world, you know, and they could comment on everything and understood how everything worked.
Well, there's an interesting, I mean, there's obviously a whole question here about the history of science, but when you see famous examples like Einstein or Stephen Hawking, who did, over the course of their careers, become people who commented on a whole wide range of things where at least nominally they didn't really have any expertise, right?
Right, true. Yeah, there's this weird one-way street. It's like a lot of scientists think they can comment on all world affairs, but I wouldn't say that every historian feels that they can comment on
particle physics? No,
on particle
probably
physics.
not.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like, you know, this is the kind of thing that you see in the tech industry for anyone who spent time hanging out with a lot of techies.
Yes.
Like there really is, I mean, you often nowadays see this with like the real push towards getting like coding in elementary and middle schools, right? Making it something you learn immediately, getting computers in school. Like, it's like these things are, we're told by Silicon Valley and its foundations that these things are sort of like innately good for us, that we need to have more computing knowledge, we need to have more coding knowledge, that this is like the way of the future. Everything needs to be quantified, right? Even our steps. I mean, that's sometimes called computationalism, this idea that it's inherently good to just count everything you do or think. Like the Apple Watch has that built into it. It counts your steps no matter what you do. It has this idea of like, it, you know, of course you would want to do that. It's automatic. You don't have a choice.
You talk a lot, one of the most interesting parts of this book for people who are concerned about the way that technology interacts with society and politics right now, you talk about the difference between what's now called Web 1.0 in the late 90s, the big sort of so-called tech boom that went bust right around the time of the 9/11 attacks, and then Web 2.0, where we've had all this stuff more recently, social media and its very ambiguous relationship with commerce and with our private lives.
Right.
And, you know, of course, all the stuff around the 2016 election, and Facebook and other forms of social media. Would you say that as somebody who's been following this for a long time, you sort of saw that moment of reckoning with Web 2.0 coming, like the gradual recognition that the social media revolution also had a dark side?
Yeah, well, I mean, I may be a little too young to have totally foreseen it, but I do remember hearing someone I quote in the book, James Cassio, speak at a conference at Stanford in 2005, and he had this little like polemic that was called the participatory panopticon. And he argued, I mean, he was right. This was 2005, so this is before.
Sure.
I mean, Facebook may have just started to exist.
But it really wasn't a thing yet. Yeah.
It wasn't a thing yet. Twitter, I don't think existed
I don't
yet.
think that existed then. No.
MySpace existed. I had a MySpace. But, you know, the idea that he had, which has come to true, was sort of like, you know, what we call surveillance capitalism. Like that we're going to be lulled into this world where, like that's a panopticon. This idea of the panopticon, that someone, an unseen watcher, could look and see what you're doing at any time, but you're never aware necessarily that they're watching you. But that it would be participatory, that we would willingly
We've
want
all
to
signed up for
share
it.
all.
Yes.
Yeah, but the thing is that's not like the tech industry had to create that culture. Like nobody 10 years ago, I would have thought it was weird for someone to share a picture of their breakfast. Like that wasn't like the tech industry was very active when they moved to this model of surveillance capitalism where you need to like constantly want to share tiny bits of your life in order for them to make money, because the more time you spend staring at your screen and looking into it, you know, they had to create that culture. So there was this whole kind of drive to like normalize that type of behavior, and that's kind of yeah, like some people, I don't know if I saw it coming, but I listened to people who saw it coming. Yeah.
I've heard people express this theory that what we see now in the tech industry in its effect on the larger society is something like the replacement of what we used to call the public sphere, which would include, you know, the welfare state and public education and parks and the public libraries and all the stuff the government used to fund, with a sort of pseudo-public sphere where you're sharing things with people, but it has this, you know, weird other dimension to it, and everything is transactional and everything is commercialized. Is there some validity to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the darkest aspects of how, like, the tech industry has stoked this like narcissistic oversharing culture. Is that it's like the ultimate goal of social media is to transform the self into a brand, so that you don't do anything without thinking of how it interacts with it. So it's kind of it's interesting because it's the opposite. You know, I remember in the 2000s when I was coming of age politically, like during the George W. Bush regime, you know, there was all this stuff about
Keith is a lot younger than me, if you haven't figured that part out.
There's a lot of, like, you know, do you remember the whole like corporations aren't people type movement?
Oh, sure.
Like you hear that refrain a lot in the 2000s, like, oh, we need to get rid of corporate personhood. But now it's the reverse, where it's a lot of people, individuals want to sort of become not people, but like brands.
Yeah.
They're like an individual corporation, and you know, the other kind of depressing thing is like that's also a side effect of like a decaying social welfare state. It's like if you are of little means, like, and you know, you have a sort of incentive to monetize. It's nice to be able to monetize yourself. Like if you don't have a lot of money but you have a huge number of followers, you can certainly figure out ways to get them to give you money.
And where's the chicken and the egg here? Did the tech industry just capitalize on this intense fragmentation or atomization or whatever you want to use that trend in society? Did the tech industry create it, or did it just ride along with it? What's your sense about that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that the sort of on like a macroeconomic scale, I don't think that, like, the tech industry has created a lot of inequality, right? I mean, it's sort of decimated a lot of middle class industries.
You document extensively in here. Yeah.
But I think given economic trends, you know, even without the tech industries throwing gas in the fire, we were sort of bound to be in a less equal society, a far more, you know, unequal world, just by other economic trends that were happening prior. But they certainly seem content to like capitalize. I'm always surprised by, I'm eternally surprised by the creative ways that the tech industry keeps figuring out to like, you know, underpay people or trick people into making less money than they think they're going to make, or like sort of exploit them every single second and convince them it's a good thing. I mean, I could think of a lot of examples, but you know.
It's, you know, the comparison has been made so often between the invention of the internet or the tech industry more broadly and like, you know, Johannes Gutenberg and the printing press.
Right.
These technological changes that create an entire new sort of information system.
Yeah.
But obviously a lot of people who publish books found a way to make money off the printing press. That was one of its major, so that's a similarity. But I don't get the feeling that at any point in its 500 years of existence that the industry for publishing books successfully created this mythology around itself.
Yeah.
That it was transforming every aspect of human relations.
Sure. Yeah. It didn't have the PR apparatus that it did. Yeah. I mean, no, that's true, and it's an interesting parallel because the tech. It's like, you know, sometimes when you try to describe the tech industry and how it's become now in Web 2.0, it's kind of like it's a mix of a printing press, a telephone, a telegraph. Like a sort of mapping system, like
a TV set,
a radio.
Yeah.
It doesn't quite have any historical analogs. So a lot of that breaks down when you try to describe it.
One of the things that my son and I often joke about is the device. Well, I don't have it in my pocket now because we're broadcasting, but that device that you and I carry around all the time. Mm-hmm. If we could get Alexander Graham Bell awakened from the grave for a few minutes and show him that device, would he have any idea what it is?
Yeah.
You know, or what its relationship is to the thing that he maybe didn't invent but perfected? You know?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Not a lot of similarity there, right?
No, definitely not. Yeah, and I mean the design of the phone now, you know, the fact that there's a camera in the front is really telling. That tells you a lot about what the makers of that device want you to do with it. You know,
right? That's interesting.
And how to use it. There was no camera. Alexander Graham Bell could not have foreseen that he would pick up his phone and look at it, and there'd be a camera looking back at him.
Presumably, a lot of the stuff that's in this book was essentially putting together things that you already knew something about and doing some deeper research into that. What in doing the research for this book really surprised you? What did you not know that you learned in putting this book together?
I think the most surprising thing was, the very beginning of the book actually starts with colonization of the Bay Area, because there's actually some interesting parallels between gentrification and when the Spanish missionaries colonized that region.
That was fascinating.
And I think one of the things, you know, this is like going way back, but one of the things that really fascinated me that I never realized was that before Europeans came to Northern California, that the Native Americans had a totally different relationship with animals. Like, it's well documented. Like there's some quote that
I hadn't read that before. I'm going to have to search that one out.
Yeah. There's some quote that, like, you know, that one of the Spanish missionaries had that was like, the animals aren't afraid of us. Like, this is so weird. There's so many animals. And there was, like, you know, some comment that another missionary made that you could shoot your gun at the sky and you'd hit like 7 birds because they were just so rich. And also that even predators were like, they would just be like, they wouldn't attack humans. Like, there would just be like mountain lions and coyotes and wolves like walking around, and they would just like see the Ohlone people and, like, you know, whatever the animal equivalent is of a wave. They just weren't afraid. Like, it was just the Bay. You know, like, I think that we think the Bay Area is still, because the environmental movement was sort of like centered there. It has a lot of open space. You can go hiking. You can go hiking, and you can go to a you know, not that far from like Stanford or something. You can be hiking and feel like you're in the remote wilderness. But going back and doing the research about what it was like, life was like for Native Americans, made me realize that even in a remote place in Northern California, you're still getting a fundamentally, completely different experience of the wildlife because of how European attitudes towards technology and towards animals and how to exploit them made them afraid of us in a way that...
That's so wild.
Yeah.
Keith Spencer, an editor at Salon and the author of A People's History of Silicon Valley.
Hold it up.
There it is right there. Keith, we will let you get out of our frozen studio and our frozen city and back to the warm, if overly gentrified, Bay Area.
Certainly.
Keith, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah,
All right,
thank you.
Take care.